The house that vanished. The air around our house in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Austin, Texas, always hummed with the scent of blooming jasmine in spring and the earthy richness of pecan trees in autumn. For 32 years, that scent was the very breath of my life, a comforting perfume that marked the passage of seasons, each one bringing new memories within our walls. Our home wasn't just a structure of bricks and mortar. It was a living, breathing entity, saturated with laughter, whispered secrets, and the quiet rhythm of our family life. It was where James and I had raised our two vibrant children, Lily and Marcus, where we'd celebrated countless Christmases, weathered the turbulent storms of teenagehood, and grown gracefully old together, hand in hand. Or so I believed. James, with his gentle humor, his reassuring presence, and his seemingly boundless energy, handled everything. He was the unwavering rock, the dependable protector, the one who navigated the intimidating complexities of bills, investments, and of course the omnipresent mortgage. "Don't you worry your pretty head about the numbers, Evelyn," he'd always say, his blue eyes twinkling with affection. "That's my job. You just keep this beautiful home warm and filled with your light." And I did. I trusted him implicitly, completely, with every fiber of my being, never questioning, never doubting. Then, without warning, the anchor broke. James. My steadfast, irreplaceable James collapsed one Tuesday morning while making his usual morning coffee, a sudden, brutal heart attack stealing him from me in an instant. The world tilted on its axis. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock, all became deafeningly loud in the sudden crushing silence that replaced his vibrant presence. The funeral was a disorienting blur of sympathetic faces, hushed condolences, and a pain so profound it felt physical, a gaping wound in my soul. My children, Lily and Marcus, were there, their faces etched with grief, holding me steady through the haze of loss, their young shoulders bearing a weight I wouldn't wish on anyone. Once the initial, overwhelming wave of mourning had subsided, replaced by a dull, aching emptiness that permeated every corner of my being, the stark, unforgiving practicalities of widowhood began to surface, like grim harbingers of an approaching storm. My first daunting task was to sort through James's study, a room I rarely entered, respecting his need for a private sanctuary where he managed his important business. It was meticulously organized, as always, his desk neat, his files precisely labeled. But amidst the neatly stacked papers, I began to find them. Unopened envelopes, disguised as junk mail, tucked away behind larger, more innocuous documents in a locked drawer. Then came the red notices, slipped into old magazines ignored, foreclosure warnings. Each discovery sent a chilling cold seeping into my bones, spreading rapidly through my veins. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, desperately seeking an escape. This couldn't be right. James was meticulous. He was responsible. He wouldn't let this happen. A week later, the official, dreaded envelope arrived. A thick, ominous letter from the bank, its logo a stark, red beacon of dread. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a final, undeniable notice. My eyes blurred as I read the cold, clinical words. Notice of default. Foreclosure proceedings. Eviction in 20 days. 20 days. My breath hitched in my throat. a silent gasp of disbelief. I frantically called the bank, my voice trembling, pleading for an explanation, for clarity, for a glimmer of hope. The customer service representative, calm and dispassionate, explained with polite formality that the mortgage had not been paid for the last 8 months. 8 months. My world, already shattered by grief, fragmented further, each piece a shard of incomprehensible betrayal, a stark, painful truth. And then came the revelation that truly stopped my heart, squeezing the air from my lungs. James had secretly refinanced the house years ago, without my knowledge or consent, taking out a significantly larger loan, using the equity as collateral for what they vaguely termed business investments. The house, our beloved home for 32 years, the bedrock of our life, was no longer truly ours. It was a ticking bomb, and James, in his desperate secrecy, had silently set the timer, sealing our fate. The following days were a desperate, futile battle, a whirlwind of phone calls and unanswered pleas. I called lawyers, begged the bank for extensions, for understanding, for mercy. Each conversation was a fresh stab of pain. Each polite rejection, a brutal reminder of my utter helplessness. Mrs. Miller, we understand this is difficult, but the terms of the loan were clear. Your husband signed the documents. The terms of a loan I knew absolutely nothing about. The terms of a loan that had been a silent, agonizing secret, held tightly by the man I loved and trusted more than anyone in the world. The shame burned, a hot, angry flush creeping up my neck, a brand of public humiliation. How could he? Why? Why would he keep this devastating truth from me, from his family? Lily and Marcus, grappling with their own raw grief for their father, saw my growing distress, the haunted look in my eyes. "Mom, what's going on? You look terrible. You haven't eaten." I tried desperately to hide the full extent of the disaster, mumbling vague phrases about complicated paperwork issues and bank errors, but the truth, raw and ugly, refused to be contained. When I finally confessed, sitting them down at the very kitchen table where we'd shared a lifetime of meals, where they'd done their homework and celebrated birthdays, their faces mirrored my own initial shock, then swiftly moved to a profound anger, a visceral protectiveness. "He did what?" Marcus exclaimed, his voice rising in disbelief, his gentle face contorted with outrage. Lily, ever the pragmatic one, immediately started researching, making calls to her own contacts in the legal world. But even her sharp legal mind, her unwavering determination, couldn't find a loophole. The bank was within its rights. We had 20 days, 20 agonizing days, to pack a lifetime into boxes, to abandon the only home I had ever known as an adult, the place where every memory resided. The thought of imposing on my children, of becoming a burden, of watching their own lives shrink to accommodate my shattered existence, was unbearable. Lily lived in a small apartment downtown, barely enough room for herself and her demanding career. Marcus, though his place was more spacious, was constantly traveling for work, a digital nomad. My pride, bruised and battered, refused to let them see me in this state of absolute destitution, this public display of failure. "I'll manage," I insisted, my voice tight with forced resolve. "I'll find a small place. Just give me some time to sort things out, to grieve properly." My shame was a heavy cloak, suffocating me, hiding my vulnerability even from those who loved me most, those who would have offered help without a second thought. So, when the eviction date arrived, a harsh, unforgiving deadline marked by the cruel Austin sun, I was alone. The furniture was packed and hauled away, the house stripped bare, empty and echoing, a hollow shell of its former self. I stood on the sidewalk, a single small suitcase at my feet, watching the movers empty my entire life onto a truck. Piece by agonizing piece, Mrs. Gray, our sweet elderly neighbor for decades, came out, her face etched with sorrow, her eyes wide with concern. "Evelyn, dear, what's happening? Why are they taking everything?" I could only shake my head, tears streaming down my face, my voice choked with despair. "They're taking the house, Martha. Everything." I spent the first night in a cheap, anonymous motel on the outskirts of Austin, the fluorescent lights humming incessantly, the stale air thick with the scent of disinfectant and despair. I lay awake, staring at the peeling wallpaper, the years of security and comfort evaporating into the grim, terrifying reality of my new existence. From the jasmine-scented tranquility of my cherished home to this desolate, impersonal box. The contrast was a cruel joke, a cosmic mockery of my trust. The next few weeks were a disorienting blur of even cheaper motels, each one a little shabbier, a little more hopeless than the last, until my meager emergency savings dwindled to nothing, leaving me with nowhere else to go. Then came the shelter. The haven, it was called, a grim irony given its stark reality. It was a bustling, noisy place, filled with the desperate whispers of shattered lives, the pungent smell of too many bodies in too small a space. I was Evelyn Miller, the woman who had hosted elegant garden parties, who had volunteered at the local library, who had always known the comfort of a soft bed and a hot meal. Now, I was a nameless face among many, another elderly woman whose life had taken an unexpected, brutal turn, swallowed by the gaping maw of circumstance. The humiliation was a constant, suffocating companion, a burning brand on my soul, a reminder of my catastrophic fall from grace. I hid my tears in the communal bathroom, choked down tasteless institutional food, and desperately tried to make myself invisible, a ghost among ghosts. I couldn't bring myself to tell Lily and Marcus where I was. How could I admit to my children that their mother, who had always embodied strength and grace, was now irrevocably, utterly homeless? The days in the shelter bled into weeks, then months, each one chipping away at my sense of self, at the last vestiges of my old identity. The stench of stale sweat and disinfectant, the constant cacophony of snoring, coughing, low, defeated murmurs, and the pervasive lack of privacy. It was a sensory assault that never ceased. I found myself clinging to small, almost ritualistic routines, waking before dawn, making my way to the public library when it opened, burying myself in books, losing myself in stories, anything to escape the unbearable reality, the crushing weight of my new existence. I was still Evelyn Miller by name, but I felt like a stranger inhabiting a body that no longer truly belonged to me, a ghost of my former self. I often revisited memories, a desperate, almost obsessive attempt to find an answer, a clue, a reason for James's inexplicable, devastating betrayal. I pictured our early days in Austin, a vibrant, optimistic city where we'd arrived as young lovers, full of hopes and dreams. Our first apartment, small but filled with the promise of a future. The exhilarating excitement of buying our first house, a charming fixer-upper that we slowly, lovingly transformed into our sanctuary, our shared masterpiece. James, then, was a meticulous accountant, diligent and precise, his numbers always adding up. When did it change? When did the fear, the secrecy, the desperate clinging to appearances begin to fester like a hidden disease? I remembered isolated incidents, fleeting moments I'd dismissed at the time. His sudden insistence on handling all financial mail, his unusual stress before quarterly reports, the way he'd subtly change the subject or snap at me if I ever mentioned our mortgage or finances. I'd attributed it to his dedication, his desire to protect me from the boring minutiae of finances, to shield me from any burden. Now, those memories were poisoned, twisting into chilling, undeniable signs of his silent descent, his losing battle against unseen forces. He must have been terrified, trapped in a spiral he couldn't escape, too proud, too consumed by shame to admit his failures to anyone, especially to me. In the shelter, amidst the despair, I found a flicker of unexpected, life-saving connection. Sarah, a woman in her late 60s with a kind, weathered face and eyes that had seen far too much of the world's cruelty, took me under her wing. She was a former elementary school teacher, a gentle soul. Evicted from her small home after her son, a kind but misguided man, gambled away her entire life savings. "We're all here for a reason, dear," she'd said, her voice raspy from too many nights of sleeping rough, but gentle as a balm. "Doesn't make it any easier, but you're not alone. And the first rule is, never give up." Sarah taught me the unspoken rules of the shelter, how to secure a good spot for the night, where to find the best, albeit free, coffee. She shared her limited rations, her meager comforts. She showed me a resilience I didn't know I possessed, a quiet defiance that sparked something dormant within me. We'd sit for hours, sharing stories, two broken women finding strength, dignity, and even a flicker of humor in each other's presence. Father Patrick, a kind, tired priest who oversaw the shelter, also offered a quiet strength, his compassionate eyes holding no judgment. I began to realize that despair was a luxury I simply couldn't afford. I had to fight, not just for myself, but for the ghost of the woman I used to be, for the memory of the life I had lost. My hands, once skilled at baking intricate pastries for church bazaars and tending a lush, vibrant garden, now felt useless, trembling with uncertainty. But then I remembered my love for knitting, a skill passed down from my grandmother. Sarah helped me find some discarded yarn and bent needles. I began to knit hats and scarves, simple at first, then more intricate designs. I sold them for a few dollars to other residents or at a small, local flea market where a sympathetic vendor, an elderly Latina woman named Elena, allowed me a small corner. Every dollar earned was a triumph, a tiny reclamation of dignity, a whisper of hope in the vast silence of my despair. It was meager, yes, but it was mine. The small acts of survival, the quiet defiance against my brutal circumstances, slowly started to rebuild my shattered self-worth, piece by painstaking piece. The children, however, were growing increasingly worried. My phone calls had become sporadic, my excuses flimsy, my voice thin and strained. Lily, with her sharp lawyer's mind, sensed something was deeply, terribly wrong. Marcus, always more intuitive, felt a chilling void where his mother's vibrant presence used to be. They drove to Austin, tracing my last known address, only to find the house boarded up, a stark foreclosed sign mocking them from the front lawn, a cruel monument to shattered dreams. Their shock turned to frantic fear. They questioned Mrs. Gray, who, tears in her eyes, confessed she didn't know where I went, but confirmed the devastating eviction, her voice filled with helpless sorrow. Their search was relentless, a frantic scramble against time. They combed the city, calling hospitals, social services, until a kind, observant police officer, noticing Lily's desperate, tear-streaked face, subtly directed them towards the Haven, mentioning that an elderly woman matching my description had recently been seen there, seeking refuge. Their arrival at the shelter was a scene of raw, unbridled emotion. I was sitting with Sarah by a window, knitting a small blanket for a newborn at the shelter, when I saw them. Lily, her face pale with worry, then a wave of overwhelming relief. Marcus, his eyes wide with shock and guilt, his jaw slack. "Mom!" Lily cried, rushing towards me, her arms outstretched, pulling me into a fierce embrace that threatened to crush me. I clung to her, tears I had held back for weeks, months, finally pouring down my face, a torrent of grief and exhaustion and relief. "Oh, my babies," I whispered, the shame of my circumstances battling with the overwhelming comfort of their presence, their unconditional love. Marcus, his voice choked with emotion, pulled away slightly, his eyes scanning the grim reality of the shelter. "Mom, why? Why didn't you tell us? Why are you here?" His eyes swept across the crowded, bleak room, the rows of cots, the weary faces, and I saw his complete, devastating realization, his understanding of the depth of my fall, the abyss I had been living in. The guilt in his eyes mirrored my own, a shared burden of unspoken pain. The children insisted I move in with them immediately, offering their homes, their unwavering support. But I refused, not out of stubborn pride anymore, but a newfound, quiet resolve. "I need to do this my way," I told them, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. "I need to stand on my own 2 feet again. I need to prove to myself that I can, but I need your help. I can't hide anymore. I don't want to." They respected my decision, understanding that this was a crucial step in my healing. Instead, they found me a tiny, affordable studio apartment in an older, eclectic part of Austin, a small, independent space that felt like a palace after the shelter, a beacon of hope. It was mine, truly mine. Their first priority was to untangle the devastating financial mess James had left behind. In his meticulously kept old files, among innocuous utility bills and old insurance policies, hidden beneath tax documents from years ago, Marcus found a small, locked metal box. Inside, not money, but a series of desperate, tear-stained letters from James to an old college friend, dating back almost a decade. In them, James confessed to a series of disastrous business ventures, failed investments in speculative tech startups, and a growing, debilitating gambling addiction he'd developed in an attempt to recoup his mounting losses. He spoke of the crushing pressure to maintain his image, to keep Evelyn's perfect world intact, shielded from his failures. He was drowning, consumed by shame, too proud, too terrified to admit his failures to anyone, convinced he could fix it all on his own. Just one more big win. "I can't tell Evelyn," one letter read, his handwriting desperate. "It would break her heart. She trusts me too much. I can't live with her disappointment." The letters were a gut punch, a painful but necessary truth. Not only did they finally explain the agonizing why, they revealed the depth of James's secret despair, the silent, tormenting struggle he'd waged alone for years. My anger, the last vestiges of it, finally dissolved, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking sadness for the man he had become. Trapped by his own pride and fear, isolated by his secrets, he hadn't meant to betray me. He had simply been terribly, tragically lost, consumed by a darkness he couldn't share. Lily, armed with this new, devastating information and her sharp legal mind, sought out a young, passionate lawyer specializing in elder abuse and complex financial fraud cases. His name was Michael, and he was an ardent, tireless advocate for those wronged by deceptive practices and systemic injustice. Michael was initially skeptical, his expression guarded, but after reading James's desperate letters and seeing the overwhelming evidence of the bank's aggressive foreclosure, the speed of the eviction, he saw not just a victim, but a compelling case of vulnerability exploited, a grave injustice. "We can't get your old house back, Mrs. Miller," he conceded, his voice gentle but firm, "but we can fight to ensure you're not left with insurmountable debt. And we can raise public awareness about how this happens to so many unsuspecting seniors." The battle with the bank was arduous, a grueling dance of legal maneuvering and frustrating bureaucracy. But this time, I wasn't alone. With Michael's keen legal expertise and my children's unwavering support, I sat across from the cold, impersonal bank representatives. I spoke with a quiet dignity, no longer the hysterical widow, but a woman who understood the bitter truth, who refused to be silenced. While the house remained irretrievably lost, Michael skillfully negotiated a significant settlement. It wasn't enough to buy back the house, but it was enough to relieve me of the bulk of the outstanding debts James had accrued, protecting my future from financial ruin and providing a small but crucial foundation for a new beginning. It was a partial victory, yes, but a crucial one, a symbol of regaining control. During the painful process of sifting through old photo albums for legal documents, Lily found a stack of faded pictures from our early marriage, from our honeymoon in Europe. In one taken during our trip to Paris, James looked tired, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, a subtle tension around his mouth that I had dismissed then as jet lag from the long flight. In another, from a family vacation in Italy years later, his gaze was distant, preoccupied, even as he held my hand, ostensibly enjoying the view. I saw it now with the painful clarity of hindsight, the subtle, insidious signs of a man weighed down by unspoken burdens, struggling beneath a facade of happiness, slowly being consumed by his secrets. The why was clearer now, a tragic tapestry woven from fear, pride, and ultimately a misguided, desperate attempt to protect me from a truth he couldn't face himself. My own healing accelerated, propelled by a newfound sense of purpose. I continued my knitting, expanding into custom designs, finding a small but loyal clientele through online marketplaces and local craft fairs. I began to speak at community centers, at women's groups, sharing my story, not for pity, but for empowerment. I talked about the importance of financial literacy for all, even within trusted relationships, about the dangers of unchecked pride, and about the surprising, undeniable resilience of the human spirit. Inspired by my story and the stories of others I'd met in a shelter, Lily and Marcus decided to channel their own grief and anger into something profoundly positive. Together, with my guidance, they established Evelyn's Haven, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing immediate aid, comprehensive legal counsel, and crucial emotional support to elderly individuals facing unexpected homelessness due to financial fraud, family betrayal, or catastrophic life events. Sarah, my invaluable friend from the shelter, became one of our first, most dedicated volunteers, her lived experience a powerful testament to our mission. Father Patrick from the old shelter became an advisor to our board, his quiet wisdom abiding light. I didn't get my old house back, no. The jasmine still blooms in the Austin suburbs, but in someone else's garden. But I gained something far, far more valuable. I found my voice. I found my strength. I became a symbol of hope for others, a living testament that even when the very foundations of your life crumble, you can rebuild not just a house, but a stronger, more authentic, more purposeful self. My small Austin apartment, humble but filled with the warmth of newfound purpose, the quiet hum of knitting needles, and the unwavering love of my children and the burgeoning community we were building, became my true home. The scent of jasmine still lingered in my memory, but now it was no longer associated with loss, but with the quiet triumph of a spirit that had faced the fiercest storm and found its way, not just back to safety, but to a profound, unshakable peace.